So I will start off with the first module, Module A1, titled Introduction to the Enhanced Transparency Framework and the National Transparency System. First, I'll give you an outline of this presentation. The first topic is the the context to climate change, followed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The third topic is the Paris Agreement and the Enhanced Transparency Framework. And the final topic is the National Transparency System of Trinidad and Tobago. And during this presentation, you will see a lot of abbreviations. Okay. I also added some objectives. So by the end of this module, you should gain a basic understanding of the human-induced origins, impacts, and the urgency of climate change, and awareness of the international climate governance frameworks, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, abbreviated UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement. Thirdly, recognition of key principles guiding global climate action, such as common but differentiated responsibilities. And lastly, understanding the role of reporting mechanisms in enhancing transparency and accountability. So let's start with the first topic, the context to climate change. So the UNFCCC defines climate change as a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that changes the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. The greenhouse effect is linked to climate change. So the greenhouse effect is a natural process needed to sustain life. Without the greenhouse effect, the earth will basically freeze over. All right. The greenhouse effect occurs due to greenhouse gases which retain heat, and the four main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, nitrous oxide, N2O, and the fluorinated gases, example, hydrofluorocarbons. This image to the center shows the greenhouse effect. Okay, so we have the sun here, and we have the earth, and it has 6 steps here, and let's go through it. So first, the sun's radiation moves towards the earth. About half of it is reflected or absorbed by clouds and the atmosphere. The rest reaches the earth, where some is absorbed by the ocean and land. The earth also releases heat back into space, and some of the heat passes through the atmosphere, but most is captured and retained by the greenhouse gases mentioned. So this is the natural greenhouse effect. All right, so this slide compares the natural greenhouse effect to the enhanced greenhouse effect, which is caused by human activity. Okay, so in the natural greenhouse effect, more heat escapes into space, but in the enhanced greenhouse effect, the greater concentration of greenhouse gases traps more heat, okay, leading to basically like a thermal blanket and increase in global temperatures and global warming. Okay. So what causes climate change? So human activity is responsible for increasing greenhouse gas emissions since industrialization around 1850. So some of the sources of greenhouse gases are industry and energy, example fossil fuel burning, land use change, and deforestation, agriculture, mainly livestock farming like ruminants. They release methane from enteric fermentation and also pore waste management. So continuing from the previous figure, which had up to zero point 0.6, the enhanced greenhouse effect is where more greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere and more heat is retained by the earth. So what happens is that the earth, air, and the oceans heat up just like a greenhouse. Okay? Now let's look at some of the greenhouse gas emissions and the relation to um, the rise in global temperature. So this is a very busy slide and a small part of it is cut off, but let's take it from the left. So we have the anthropogenic, which is a big word for man-made or human-made, all right, greenhouse gas emissions. And this tend to, has exponentially increased from, so on the left axis here we have 1850, here we have 2019. So the dark color here is carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and industry, all right? And then we have carbon dioxide emissions from land use change and forestry. And then we have all the other greenhouse gases represented as non-CO2 emissions. So the first take-home message is we have this exponential increase in greenhouse gases. All right, and these increase in greenhouse gas emissions have caused increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. For example, in around 1850, the concentration of carbon dioxide was around 280 parts per million, and the graph goes on to 2019 and it says, so you can see it increased from 280 to 410 parts per million. And as you sit here in this room, you are breathing in air with about 426 parts per million carbon dioxide, according to NOAA. And the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations have caused a global surface temperature rise by 1.1 degrees from 1850 to 1900. All right, so we have the baseline here, and it has increased by 1.1 degrees. So it have a little issue where the edges of the slides are cut off, but I'm hoping you can still understand the information. All right, so what are the impacts of climate change? So with increased carbon dioxide concentration, you have the additional or enhanced greenhouse effect. And normally with climate change, we think about the rise in temperature and global warming, but there are a lot more other effects, such as warming of the ocean and atmosphere, melting of the cryosphere. So you could have increase in surface and ocean temperatures, melting of glaciers, sea level rise. You could have effects on global climate patterns, and also there can be high impact events which vary in intensity and frequency, such as heat waves, droughts, storms, floods. And all these, there's a lot of hours here, so they're all interconnected, all right? And they can all affect the sustainable development goals. Or I forgot to mention ocean acidification. So when carbon dioxide concentration increases, the carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form carbonic acid, and carbonic acid can lower the pH of water. Okay, so some of the sustainable development goals that are affected, and my colleagues will talk in detail on these: food insecurity, health issues, water scarcity, and there are others such as displacement and loss of biodiversity. So this slide follows and shows the influence or the human influence on physical climate changes, and the figure is based on levels of confidence. It goes from medium confidence on the left and the confidence increases as you move to the right. So what it's saying is that in terms of human influence, there's medium confidence on agricultural and ecological drought, increase in fires, increase in flooding, all right? And then the confidence increases, meaning that it's more likely to happen due to human influence, such as increase in heavy precipitation, and then it moves to very likely, such as melting and retreat of glaciers and rise in sea level rise. And as I mentioned before, in terms of what's virtually certain is upper ocean acidification and increase in hot extremes. So these changes have the potential to trigger fundamental shifts within the Earth system, and these critical thresholds are referred to as tipping points and can lead to irreversible consequences. So far we have seen the causes and the impacts, and now we are going to look at what have been done to address climate change. So by the 1970s, environmental concerns began to gain prominence globally, marking the first acknowledgement of climate change as a significant threat to the planet and as a danger to human health and well-being. There were two conferences, the first World Climate Conference in 1979 and the second one in 1990, and both were held in Geneva, Switzerland. And in 1988, there was establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, right? And this is also headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. So, switching gears, I'm going to talk now about the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC was adopted at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and it was known as the Earth Summit, and this was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. The UNFCCC is an international treaty to address challenges of climate change. And the main objective of the UNFCCC is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that prevents dangerous interference with climate systems. All right, the UNFCCC places the primary responsibility on developed nations to take the lead on climate change initiatives, given their substantial contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, both historical and current. Industrialized countries are tasked with implementing the most significant measures to reduce emissions and address climate change. And within the UNFCCC framework, these nations are categorized as Annex 1 parties. So the industrialized or developed countries are categorized as Annex 1 parties. In contrast, there is non-Annex 1 parties, and this consists mainly of developing countries with both low and middle income including both low and middle income nations. All right, so this map of the world shows the Annex 1 parties in blue, all right, and it includes mostly the industrial countries such as the OECD, all right, so it will include countries like USA, Canada, United Kingdom, and Australia. And the non-Annex 1 parties are mostly developing countries, and those would include your SIDS, your small island development states, and your LDCs, the least developed countries. So Trinidad will fall under the non-Annex 1 parties. All right. This slide talks about the principles governing the UNFCCC, and there are 5 key principles. The first one is the no harm principle, and a state or country has an obligation to prevent, diminish, and manage the risk of environmental harm to other states. So that's the first principle. The second is a common but differentiated responsibility, and this principle recognizes that while all countries are responsible for addressing climate change, some are more responsible than others. Sorry. And developed countries shall take the lead due to their greater contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and the greater capacity to address issues. Basically, they're the more wealthier countries and they have more finance available. The third principle is called the precautionary principle, and this involves taking precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimize the causes of climate change and to mitigate its adverse effects. The fourth principle is the polluter pays principle, and this makes the party who is responsible for causing the pollution to bear the cost caused by the pollution. And the final one involves sustainable development, and this means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. So the main entity of the UNFCCC is the Conference of the Parties, abbreviated as COP. All right, so the Conference of the Parties is the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC, which meets annually to review the implementation of the convention and agreed climate change instruments and provide a forum for the negotiation of new climate change agreements. The COP has 2 main objectives. One, reviewing the execution of the convention and related legal agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, and secondly, adopting resolutions to further refine and implement the adopted instruments. Okay, and the first COP meeting was in 1995 in Berlin. So this slide shows the reporting requirements of the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC requires countries to prepare reports and communication. So as you remember, the Annex 1 are your developed or industrialized countries, and the non-Annex 1 are your developing countries. All right, so the Annex 1 countries, they have to provide a greenhouse gas inventory and report annually, national communication every 4 years, and a biennial report every 2 years. The non-Annex 1 countries, they also produce, need to report on the national communication every 4 years and produce a biennial update report every 2 years. So for the developing countries, there is some flexibility in terms of the level of detail in reporting to the UNFCCC. So now I'm going to talk about the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement was negotiated, which further refined the reporting requirements of the UNFCCC, as shown in the previous slide. So the Paris Agreement was a landmark agreement. So it was a landmark legally binding international treaty to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 at COP21 in Paris and has been ratified by 191 countries. So the Paris Agreement is binding to both the Annex 1 and the non-Annex 1 parties. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming, or rise in global temperature, to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So to reduce the rise in temperature, the Paris Agreement implements NDCs. And what are NDCs? They are nationally determined contributions. So NDC is a climate action plan developed by countries under the Paris Agreement. Article 4 of the Paris Agreement requires each party to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive NDCs, and it aims to achieve and to pursue domestic measures to achieve them. The goal of the NDCs, they define the country's self-defined pledges to combat climate change within the framework of the Paris Agreement, outlining actions aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions to align with the aspiration of limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, adapt to climate impacts, and ensure sufficient finance to support these climate change efforts. Submission of NDCs. The NDCs are periodically submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat every 5 years and represents a progression compared to previous NDC and reflects the highest possible ambition. So these NDCs are submitted every 5 years. Now I'm going to move on to the Paris Agreement and the Enhanced Transparency Framework. So the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or ETF, is central to the design and operation of the Paris Agreement, aimed at strengthening the transparency and accountability of countries' climate actions. Article 13 of the Paris Agreement establishes the ETF that will enter into force by December 2024. All right. What is the goal of the ETF? To foster mutual confidence between all parties, ensure accountability of the NDCs, and promote effective implementation of climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. The core of the UTF are the biennial transparency reports, BTRs, and these will replace the current biennial update reports that we saw in a previous slide from developing countries, and the biennial reports from developed countries from 2024. This slide shows the informational elements that need to be reported under the Enhanced Transparency Framework, and which is included in the BTR. So all parties shall report on their national greenhouse gas inventory, progress, and on progress made in implementing and achieving nationally determined contributions. So you'll see shall and should, So shall is a mandatory requirement or an obligation, as we will see, and should is not a strong requirement as shall, all right, but it's strongly encouraged, so it's not an obligation. So all parties shall report on climate change impacts and adaptation. And on the right, we have the developed country parties shall report on financial technology transfer and capacity building support provided to developing countries, and the developing countries shall also report finance that is needed and received. This slide shows the existing MRV arrangements versus the enhanced transparency framework. All right, so it's basically comparing the old to the new. So you probably remember MRV stands for monitoring, reporting, and verification. Okay, so this is what's presently done, and both includes national communications, all right, but the enhanced transparency framework will include the biennial transparency reports. It has a lot of details on the slide, okay. So the biennial transparency report, all right, will include the national greenhouse gas inventory, progress made with reporting, made in implementing, and achieving NDCs, climate change impacts and adaptation, and finance support needed and received. Continuing with the operation of the enhanced transparency framework, Article 13 includes new reporting requirements which are further defined in the modalities, procedures, and guidelines, MPGs. The MPGs does define the set of rules for reporting and reviewing of information submitted by the parties, and the MPGs is what make the ETF operational. The MPGs also define the level of commitment expected from a party, and that impacts the ability of a party to fulfill its commitment under the convention. And guidance of the operationalizing of the MPGs and of the ETF through the adoption of the format and outline of the BTRs and common tabular format CTFs and common reporting tables for electronic reporting. So this slide shows some of the terminology used in the MPGs. So the MPGs use several terms that define the level of commitment expected from a party. So we saw two of them, shall. All right, so shall is an obligation, so it's a requirement. Should, it's not an obligation, all right, but is an expectation. And encouraged is the weakest. It suggests or expresses hope, okay? So this figure presents the information to be reported in the BTR, including the relevant chapter of the MPGs for the reporting requirements. So on the left, we have each party shall provide a national inventory report of greenhouse gas emissions, sources and removal by sinks. And the second point here, which is related to these chapters in the MPGs, all right, is each party shall provide the information necessary to track progress in implementing and achieving the NDC. The third, each party shall provide information on climate change impacts and adaptation. And the fourth talks about climate finance provided. And the last one deals with climate finance received. All right, this figure indicates the timeline for moving towards the reporting requirements of the ETF under the Paris Agreement. So we see the 2024 here. So on the left, developed countries, their final biennial reports were due on December 2022. Developing country parties, the final biennial update reports is due this year, December 2024. Okay, but these will be replaced by all parties, all right, will be reporting based on the biennial transparency reports, all right. So the first BTRs are due by the 31st of December 2024, but the SIDS and LDCs that I mentioned before have discretion, okay? And there will be continuous reporting by the developed country parties in terms of annual greenhouse gas inventories and national communications. And developing country parties will continue reporting on national communications. So what the ETF does is bring enhancing reporting requirements for developing and developed countries. So it sort of levels the playing field. So they will have the same reporting requirements. All right, changing gears, we're going on to the final topic. All right, which deals with the national transparency system of Trinidad and Tobago. So we have seen the reporting requirements of all countries. All right, so let's look at how Trinidad and Tobago goes about its reporting. So what is the NTS? In the ongoing pursuit of climate resilience and meeting obligations under the Paris Agreement, TNT has embarked on an ambitious initiative to enhance its capacity in climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. In this context, the NTS serves as a robust platform for TNT to monitor, analyze, and report on vital informational elements essential for evaluating the nation's climate action strategies. So the governing body is the EMA, and this is the website here, the portal, all right, for the National Transparency System. The NTS serves as a cornerstone in TNT's broader commitment to transparent, precise, and comprehensive reporting under the ETF of the Paris Agreement. So what is the NTS of Trinidad and Tobago objective? The main objective is to systematically monitor and report on the nation's progress towards its NDC and adaptation measures. The system is designed to gather, manage, and analyze climate-related data, enabling informed decision-making, policy formulation, and reporting to global entities, thus contributing to global climate objectives and strengthening national climate resilience. This will help build trust, engage stakeholders like yourself, improve sustainability performance, and promote collaboration among stakeholders. The NTS serves a number of key functions, and you can see all of them there, but I'll mention a few of them. So one is promoting and mainstreaming transparency, strengthening institutional capacity, supporting the environmental sector, enhancing resilience, effective multilateral environmental agreement compliance, documents and records management, data scoping and analysis, and it also facilitates reporting to the UNFCCC. Some of the key aspects of the NTS are local and international reporting. It integrates with the common tabular formats of the Paris Agreement to streamline the tracking and reporting of TNT's initiatives aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and achieving its NDC. The target audience, the NTS is tailored to meet the needs of a diverse array of users who are involved in climate action, environmental management, and sustainability, both locally and internationally. So some examples of these stakeholders, and I think it's represented in the room, will be like government ministries and departments, NGOs, public and private sector, international organizations, and educational institutions like UWI. In terms of implementation, the NTS has been developed with a sophisticated cloud-based solution which centralized, simplified, and secure the data management process, which is critical to TNT's climate efforts. Another key aspect is workflow. The workflow for the NTS is a structured process for the submission, approval, and reporting of climate action data. And the final one, sort of going off the slide here, but it deals with capacity building. All right, so the NTS is accompanied by a user manual, which equips users with comprehensive instructions on effectively utilizing the NTS. So I know that was a bit of a lot of information, and even as a trainee, it was a lot of information for us in a very short time. As Kishan said, he has been doing it for 30 years, and we probably 3 weeks, a few weeks. Yeah, so, but I wanted to provide a summary slide, all right? And so this should be my final slide. So these are some of the key points that I raised. Firstly, we defined climate change. We talk about the enhanced greenhouse effect, the greenhouse gases, increasing the concentration of the greenhouse gases, increasing in the atmosphere. We mentioned global warming, all right? And that would put everything in context, all right, for all these institutions and that came into place. So one of the institutions was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, all right, which is an international environmental treaty aimed to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations for the climate system. Secondly, you will remember I mentioned COP, the Conference of the Parties, and this is the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC. The third is the Paris Agreement, and this was a landmark agreement, so it's a legally binding international treaty under the UNFCCC, all right, which pursues efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Okay, and the Paris Agreement is binding to both the Annex 1 and the non-Annex 1 countries. Fourth, we talk about nationally determined contributions. So NDC is a climate action plan outlining a country's intended efforts to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we also mentioned the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or ETF, which establishes a common set of guidelines for all countries while providing that flexibility for the SIDS and the LDCs, the developing countries. And the last one is kind of difficult to see, but we talked about the national, you cannot see that really, the national transparency system. Okay, and with that summary, it ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your rapt attention.